to you tonight. I'm just gonna make my way to the city of light, where my heart can beat with the nightlife. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. I realize I'm the last presentation between you all and the discussion, and then our finish for the day. So I'm going to chuck right down to the cob and have a conversation here about what it means to meaningfully include and engage women in paradigms of HIV cure-related research. So dovetailing on the conversation that we've been having in the space about centering those individuals who lived in the margins, but who are predominantly impacted by the epidemic. You cannot discuss HIV, a cure, treatment, or prevention without discussing those individuals who identify as women. So Dejan so graciously reminded us that greater than 50% of the global burden of HIV lives in women. So as such, all of our future curative therapies, strategies, conversations, dialogues should be informed by the presence of women. Thank you. So I'm here as a member of the Beat Collaboratory. I'm also a member of E-Race. And I get to work with a group of dynamic individuals across the globe to do amazing work to talk about women. It's women or nothing. So I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to have this very critical conversation. You already know when you see me and David in the room, it may be a little bit of trouble. So give us grace as we stir it up just a bit, but I promise it won't be too hard. So with respect, I'd like to acknowledge the dynamic team of co-authors who co-conspirated to pull together this piece here. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Sarah Gianella Weibel at UCSD, whose guidance was absolutely instrumental, Dr. Cream Dubé, Susan Cohn, Dr. Jamila Stockman, Portia Cowlings, a bunch of team women, community members of the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, Community Women's Working Group. We do amazing work. So the impetus for the discussion for this particular paper that was published in JADES this recent December of 2022 were really results that were released at this very conference more than 1 year ago. So findings from the Impact P1107 protocol team presented described this case of a biracial Black woman who had achieved HIV remission following a stem cell transplant. And forgive me in advance if my terms are not the most up to date. I know there are several conversations happening at the community level on what acceptable language around HIV cure is, are, or should be. So as I learn, I'll continue to update my language as well. So back to this conversation about this biracial woman who was effectively cured. She had achieved HIV viral remission, making her one of 4 global individuals and potentially 5 at the time, who we now know is potentially maybe confirmed as a cure, who had been cured of HIV using stem cell transplant after an analytic treatment interruption. So the headlines touted this particular case as opening up the possibility of curing more people with HIV from diverse racial backgrounds than previously thought possible, as if it was not a for consideration prior to her being cured. It's important to note that in theory, this is entirely plausible. However, without addressing the key historical limitations, or dare I say barriers, that exist within the research industrial complex that unfairly disadvantage women from meaningfully participating in HIV research broadly, that will unequivocally be compounded in paradigms of HIV-related research. So it's no secret to any of us in this room or those in virtual attendance that women have been and continually are disproportionately impacted by HIV globally. To the point addressed earlier, more than 50% of global HIV burden rests in the bodies of women, and in particular, those individuals of African descent. So on the screen, you see figures that represent a very gendered and racialized global epidemic. So ethically, we would expect that as the search for an HIV cure forges ahead, representative populations of research participants be enrolled in these HIV cure-related research studies commensurate with their proportion of the global HIV burden. However, when you look at participants currently enrolled in HIV cure-related research, and I tip my hat to Liz and Richard for their work, there's a drastic underrepresentation of those groups. And additionally, there's a lack of geographic equity where those studies are being conducted in comparison to where the burden lies. So overwhelmingly, studies are being conducted in the US, whereas the top 10 countries with the highest global burden of HIV are on the African continent. This Western domination of future advances in HIV research presents an ongoing ethical issue that we should center as part of our conversation. What this does is present to us an ethical conundrum that we must, again, center as part of our ethics. So I believe, and I think that others should as well, that the right to benefit from scientific progress is a human right as outlined in the legally binding framework, policy framework called the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And that is that human rights should not be sidestepped in the interest of short enrollment timelines, budgetary constraints, or perceptions of ease of enrollment of one population group over another based on historical, patriarchal practices and exclusionary practices. So as it stands, the right to benefit from scientific progress is not a human right for women. And at this pace, given the continued lack of representation of women in trials, it doesn't seem to be letting up anytime soon. So we have work to do. So women's participation in clinical research continues to be limited primarily as a result of their ability to become pregnant, currently breastfeeding, and strict contraception requirements. So more importantly, women's unwillingness to participate in HIV cure research is often as a result of social structural barriers that are not factored into budgets or staffing constraints, but really is riddled with logistical support considerations that become the burden of the woman and not necessarily the site with which she interfaces to become an active participant in research. Regardless of these logistical considerations, women are not and should not be considered hard to reach, difficult to reach, messy, tough to engage, or any other synonym of the sort that you all will derive over time. And so we would like to remind you that if research is going to be truly population informed and generalizable to all groups of folks that are disproportionately impacted by HIV, it has to include representative groups of women. There's just no way around it really. And I think, 35, 40-ish years in the game and the epidemic numbers really haven't changed. It's time for us to discontinue subsequent discussions like these and actually get to a place where we can report on interventions and other strategies that address these long-term sustainable issues. So it's important, right, for informed science that women be included. So there are several, So regardless of these logistical considerations, we talked about women not being labeled, right? We said mind our language. So research that has included women in representative populations or representative numbers across the gender spectrum has highlighted the effects of sex assigned at birth on HIV pathogenesis, persistence, treatment responses, and how these sex differences may affect the HIV reservoir and immune response to therapeutic approaches being investigated as curative strategies. So the long and the short is that women must be part of HIV cure-related research. However you got to do it, working with our community-based organizations that have that expertise, then you do it. And you don't complain about it. So I think in our search to really codify what it means to be or to develop a research framework that is inclusive of women as it relates to HIV cure-related studies, we highlighted several key policy frameworks here that I'd like to share with you all. The NIH Revitalization Act of 1993 is an oldie but goodie, didn't give much teeth to this federal mandate that required that all NIH-supported research include women and minority populations, which is a term within itself problematic. I mentioned earlier the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 15 of this ICE SCR. There was a recent consensus report that was developed by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that talked about how to improve representation in clinical trials and research, again, amongst women and minority populations. But also, I'm so excited to share that APHA, the American Public Health Association, adopted policy statement 20226, which defined support for women's inclusion in HIV-related clinical research, which has broad and specific applications to the work that you all do here. So as you continue to give your work teeth, please remember to cite these ethical research frameworks as rationale for why we need to continue to center women in this effort. So as part of this work, I know this slide's a little disrespectful with the text, but we want to be clear that a community of women living with HIV, affected by HIV, who are mothers, researchers, I want to say bad HPAs, but I'm not going to say that. If you speak Pig Latin, you know what I'm saying. And just all around, dynamic people came up with a list of scalable, easily implementable action items as part of how the research industrial complex can realign itself to center women as part of its efforts. We want to remind you to fully support women's bodily autonomy and decision-making processes to freely decide whether or not she and her fetus or not can participate in an HIV cure study. Consideration of women's sexual and reproductive health freedoms that intersect with their ability to meaningfully participate in research. Don't relegate us to forms of contraception if we can freely and autonomously decide to not become pregnant. We want to call for the end of overly restrictive contraception requirements and documentation as part of the inclusion criteria for HIV cure studies. And if the paradigms will continue the way they are, provide no cost, easily accessible contraception as part of study participation. As part of study participation, we shouldn't have to go find it. If you want to make us take it, then give it to us for free and make sure it's easy that we can get it. We want to continue to have targeted representation and enrollment of women in HIV cure-related research at all phases and not just only those that are considered to be phase 2B or higher. We want to continue to engage communities and other women living with and affected by HIV early in study development. We've heard several conversations about partners. This step here also considers partners as meaningful participants in this process as well. We want to continue to meaningfully involve women from resource-limited settings, again, where the burden of HIV lies, as not only part of the participant pool, But as part of the investigators leading HIV cure-related research, Dazan and I were in the back talking, and she was like, name me one Black HIV investigator. Immediately off the top of my head, I thought about two that I can recall. And when you think about equity and answering the scientific questions by people who are not reflective of this epidemic, how far will we truly get? So we want to take care to always consider the inclusion of social behavioral sciences research to understand and address barriers to women's enrollment and retention in clinical trials. I don't care how stealth the research question is, if you can't get people to buy in, it falls flat. But I think we continue to spend and burn taxpayer dollars to answer questions that are just not community informed. So clinical trials protocols need to state the minimum percent enrollment of women. This is something that we in the Team Women or the ACTG Community Women's Working Group have been working very diligently to address. We want to understand if you have minimum percent of targeted enrollment of women in some of these studies, then you can perhaps consider sex-based comparisons when appropriate, so that the necessary information can be collected as trials are conducted. Excuse me. We want to continue to press scientific conferences and journals to enforce the requirements for the inclusion of sex and gender data, or at least a concrete plan to collect these data in future follow-up studies. CROI is notorious, until shade, but CROI is notorious for saying, as part of its abstract submission process, to include sex and gender differences. However, we stroll the poster session halls and we see 98% white cisgender men, 98% people assigned male sex at birth. And you're just like, what in the world? You look at the data and it's like a mind F. Why is this continuously allowed to take place? But we want to also ensure the accurate reporting of sex and gender. This is 2023, right? Accurately report people's sex and gender. Those two may not be aligned, but if we do not, we will continue to marginalize our trans and gender non-binary folks. The data will forever be limited if we don't do the right thing. Okay. We want to remind publications to report numbers of women enrolled in studies, even when it's zero. I think that's going to be a huge paradigm shift if you require researchers to say, you know what, there were no women enrolled in the study, even though ethically, this is a public health issue that disproportionately impacts a group of people that were not included in my study. And then lastly, or next to lastly, we want to take care to address the identification of the sex of cell lines in animals, even in preclinical studies, in addition to sex and gender of human participants. So from the Rudy to the Tootie, we have sex and gender data. So last but most certainly not least, we recognize the value added of our CBO research partners as experts to bridge the gap and support women as autonomous research participants. I want to remind you all, as you leave this place, a woman's right to choose does not stop at her desire for pregnancy, nor should her current social circumstances serve to limit her participation in research. And we remind you all, in the words of Maya Angelou, to embrace diversity. Hands off my book. I can take a few questions, or is it time for open discussion? What we do? Open discussion? Okay. Question? I know it's pretty good.
I'm not gonna run to you tonight. I'm just gonna make my way to the city of light.